Hello. Certain political forces in Europe, like their US counterparts, are sounding the alarm about migrants and the danger they supposedly pose. This xenophobia isn't an accident, but a logical outcome of the dual crises facing liberal democracy and capitalism in the West. Of course, blaming the most exploited group of people is easy, but is also misguided and entirely against their own, meaning the right wing's, interests, even by their own logic. Regardless, now, more and more people believe that those with the least power are also responsible for most of their problems, and yet the opposite continues to be true. Why is that? Let's take a look. Addendum. This doesn't mean that European migration policy hasn't been done badly in many instances, or that immigrants to Europe are all angels, or that social dynamics in many European countries aren't affected by badly thought out immigration strategies. But the fear-mongering, and very often outright lies you hear in the media is just that. This is the logical conclusion of a neoliberal Europe slowly dying as a result of the natural life cycle of the capitalist system. Let's dive a little deeper. You may have come across news that Japan and South Korea are having a population crisis because they have dangerously low fertility rates. And yeah, it's not great. We made a great video about Japan here, if you're interested. But there's something important flying under the radar. Europe's fertility rates have also been steadily declining since the mid-1960s, with only minor gains in the last 20 years. In 2023, the EU's total fertility rate fell to 1.38 live births per woman, nowhere near the 2.1 replacement level needed to sustain a population. But wait, it gets worse. Between 2017 and 2023, the EU's fertility rate plunged by 0.21, which doesn't sound like a lot, but translates to 660,000 fewer births, equivalent to losing a city the size of Frankfurt. But why? Why is this such a big deal? Let's break it down. Fewer babies means fewer workers, and Europe's workforce is aging at crisis levels. However, this is somewhat being masked by the fact that immigrants are currently patching up this hole. Right now, 1 in 5 EU workers are aged 55 to 64. That's an entire generation nearing retirement with no one to replace them because the pipeline of young people to fill those roles is shrinking faster than anyone wants to admit. This isn't some conspiracy to kill off Europeans. This is the natural progress and development of the capitalist system. Life is increasingly expensive. Public services are cut and defunded for austerity. Children are increasingly a luxury only the wealthy can afford. Is it in any way surprising that people aren't having kids? Take Greece, for example. Its birth rate collapsed so severely that 500,000 young people fled the country, which still nonetheless left a staggering 40% youth unemployment rate and a debt-to-GDP ratio up to 191%. By 2030, the EU could lose 20 million workers, equivalent to wiping out all of Romania. Older workers are now the fastest growing age group in major EU countries like Germany and Italy, bleeding productivity. These people will all retire soon and become a so-called net drain on their economies, to use the disgusting social Darwinist terms the European right enjoys. In concrete terms, Europe loses 0.2% of economic growth annually because of aging workforces, with this pattern set to increase as time goes on. The worker shortage caused by these two problems, meaning aging workers and fewer births, is being filled by the only immediate way of maintaining profits and a baseline of coherent economic development, at least within the capitalist system: migrants. Europe is addicted to and dependent on this stream of young, cheap labor. In 2017, 2.4 million non-EU migrants entered the EU, followed by 1.9 million in 2020 despite COVID shutdowns, with another major surge of 5.1 million by 2022 as Ukrainian refugees arrived. Despite dipping slightly, migration levels have remained 46% higher than pre-pandemic averages. Back to the video in just a minute. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Proton Mail. Freedom is impossible without privacy, but in the United States, your private emails, texts, and calls might not be so private. Thanks to Section 702 of the FISA Amendment Act, intelligence agencies can collect data on foreign nationals, but there's a backdoor that lets them surveil people in the United States as well. And it's not just the NSA. Federal and even local law enforcement can access personal data from third parties without a warrant. This means that your emails, your texts, and your calls are all vulnerable. That's where Proton Mail comes in. Take control of your privacy by clicking my link in the description box and downloading Proton's free encrypted email service to protect your identity online. Proton is built with privacy at its core. Headquartered in Switzerland, it's protected by some of the world's strongest privacy laws that make it illegal for Swiss companies to cooperate with foreign surveillance. This means that in principle, no government can force Proton to hand over your emails. And beyond legal protections, Proton uses end-to-end encryption, meaning your emails are locked before they even reach Proton servers. Not even Proton can read them. And it's not just email. Proton Drive, Proton Pass, and Proton Calendar all use zero-access encryption. encryption, ensuring your files, passwords, and schedules stay yours and yours alone. In a world where governments and corporations constantly look for ways to access your data, privacy shouldn't be a luxury, it should be the default. Join over 100 million people taking control of their online privacy with Proton. Get started for free using my link, proton.me/Hakeem. Thanks to Proton Mail for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is much appreciated. Alright, back to the video. Europe's economy is prosperous and productive because of migrants. That's a bold claim, so let's substantiate it. How about we take a look at the most vital industries? We'll start with construction. Mid-20th century Portuguese, Pakistani, and Turkish migrants arrived as low-skilled workers to core European economies, but soon founded entire manufacturing and construction firms of their own, reshaping cities like London, for example. Today, EU immigrants dominate the UK and French building trades, while non-EU workers in Portugal, for example, are vital to the very existence of the industry. Healthcare too rides the migrant labor train. Looking at OECD averages, immigrants all across Europe are greatly overrepresented in medicine, with foreign-born doctors representing between 30 and 50% of all doctors in countries like Sweden, Switzerland, and the UK. 35% of NHS doctors in the UK are and I quote, nationality other than British, and this is excluding people born to immigrant parents that are naturalized British citizens, but never will be British to certain strands of the British right. Accounting for those, you get even greater levels of overrepresentation, in some countries exceeding 50%. Nurses follow the same trend. Between 2010 and 2018, foreign-trained nursing staff grew by 29%, with India and the Philippines supplying the most. Again, this is because of demographics. Over 40% of EU doctors are aged 55 or older, and in countries like Bulgaria and Italy, more than half the physician workforce will retire within a decade. Without migrants, entire healthcare systems would buckle or entirely collapse. Yet even as medical schools in Bulgaria and Latvia ramp up graduates, shortages still continue. Second-generation Turkish entrepreneurs moved from ethnic enclaves, usually conditions forced upon them due to bad integration politics, to mainstream clinics and hospitals serving the entire base of society as a whole by the 1990s. EU immigrants now fill healthcare roles at rates surpassing natives in Austria and Spain, which is actually part of a larger shift, exemplified by the fact that 12% of EU immigrants own businesses that often outpace their native entrepreneur counterparts. Moving to agriculture, Moroccan nationals accounted for over 100,000 temporary work permits in Spain's agricultural sector in 2022, primarily for fruit and vegetable harvesting. This fruit populates almost every single grocery store in Europe and keeps fruit and veg somewhat reasonably priced for European consumption. Across the rest of Southern Europe, third country nationals, their quote, make up roughly 30% of seasonal workers in the agricultural sector. Migrants from Nepal and Bangladesh comprise over 1/5 of Portugal's construction workforce, primarily in urban development projects. In business, immigrant entrepreneurs are overrepresented in the founding of new businesses in Germany and in other parts of northwestern Europe. In education, international students studying in European universities generate many billions of euros per year through tuition fees and living expenses, while foreign lecturers and experts from Asia and beyond contribute to European scientific development and learning. Economically, migrants across the EU contribute as much, or in many cases more, in tax and fiscal contributions to European states than native Europeans do, and this will only increase with the aging demographics of Europe. No matter where you look, the contributions of immigrants to Europe, and particularly for European economies, is crucial for practically every sector of European economic life, despite tremendous hardships in entering into European labor markets, starting businesses, getting access to the same educational opportunities as natives, so on and so forth. And it's not just immigrants or laborers talk either. Second-generation Moroccans, for example, sidestep traditional sectors entirely, launching IT and professional service firms that cater to global markets rather than simple ethnic enclaves. Refugee entrepreneurship exploded after the so-called Arab Spring, with displaced populations carving out niches in tech and creative industries in their new homes in Europe. EU immigrants in Greece and Portugal are also outperforming natives in high-skilled roles like engineering and consulting. This is a gradual process, but it is happening. Skilled migrants aren't just filling gaps, they're driving innovation in Europe as well. In R&D heavy sectors like pharmaceuticals and medical technology, immigrants contribute to over 1/3 of the innovation output compared to native workers, but their impact isn't evenly distributed. In industries like medical instruments, where patents translate directly to profits, immigrants are disproportionately represented. Why? Because STEM expertise is portable. Unlike law or political science, coding and mechanical engineering or whatever else rely on more generally applicable concepts, not local institutional knowledge. This makes many migrants good candidates for roles in Europe's corporate labs and tech hubs. In fact, 40% of innovation in high R&D sector is tied to their contributions. Germany's Blue Card and similar visa schemes explicitly target STEM graduates and medical professionals, fueling a 5% rise in high-skilled migrants between 2000 and 2011. Foreign trade doctors surged by 46% between 2010 and 2018, dwarfing the 30% growth in domestically trained staff. This isn't a temporary fix, it's a systemic calculation. Immigrant labor subsidizes Europe's economic stability, filling roles its own aging population can't, and its broken economic system won't. Looking further at the demographics, this dependency on migrants looks essentially permanent. Migrant numbers surged from 173 million in 2000 to 272 million by 2019, driven by globalization and its insatiable demand for cheap and skilled labor. Modern neoliberal policies are forcing migrants, and even native populations, into gig work, with a lucky few, high-skilled people founding lucrative startups. In Northern Europe, immigrant entrepreneurship has been confined to household services like childcare and elder care, sectors natives increasingly avoid. The agricultural industry in the global north likewise can't ignore how migrant workers benefit rural economies, or pretend cities are the only answer for decent jobs. What's left is one of the many contradictions of capitalism. Its survival depends on migrants filling low-wage and high-skilled voids, all while aging European populations accept worse pay and working conditions, having no alternative. Politicians love to rant about border security, but behind the scenes, they're propping up a system that demands disposable labor. Neoliberal policies, like shredding unions and weakening labor laws, have turned migrants either into a permanent underclass of cheap, easily exploited and overworked labor, or skilled labor to care for the aging European economies and demographics. The EU's migration strategy is a split between performative security stunts, like border walls, and quiet backdoor deals for temporary work permits to fill the gaping shortages in practically every field. Greece's post-bailout meltdown shows how this works out. Pensions were slashed 23 times, public assets were sold off, and since locals wouldn't or couldn't do the most grueling jobs, migrants filled the void, often working under the table for poverty wages. Basically, the EU, and particularly the right wing within the EU and across Europe, is trying to have poor people's labor without having the poor people in their countries. Seasonal farmhands in Spain or delivery riders in Berlin, austerity measures depend on this underclass to keep hospitals clean and shelves stocked while corporations rake in record profits. More to the point, what about European wealth and the origin of all these immigrants? It's no secret that Europe's wealth wasn't earned, it was mostly stolen. If you deny this, you're denying history. Some resort to tired platitudes like conquering has happened since the beginning of time, which, sure, but colonialism and entrenched systems of economic dependence are thoroughly European inventions. I made a dedicated video on this here. Generally though, the most commonly cited example of this was the vicious conquest of the Americas and the transatlantic slave trade. But the worst of colonial violence isn't physical, it's structural. Arbitrary borders slice through ethnic and tribal lands, creating divides, on purpose, of course, that still ignite conflicts to this day. In Somalia, British and French colonial mapmakers fractured communities, displaced millions, and destabilized the region for generations to come, simply for trade routes and natural resource access. Indigenous economies were erased. Sustainable farming gave way to monoculture cash crops like sugar, which, following disruption of traditional slave routes, led Europe to intensify its exploitation of Africa through other means. Free trade began, from the start, as a system of heavy protectionism for me and wide open markets for thee, while I have the technological and military advantage to thoroughly exploit your resources and labor. Otherwise, it's right back to tariffs, just as the US has been doing recently in its waning years. This is the true face of free trade. We are still living in the colonial era. Don't let the rebranding fool you. Today, corporate extraction and political sabotage sustain the same cycles of dependency. It's time for the obligatory Libya mention. In 2011, NATO's illegal regime change operation didn't bring prosperity, because it never was the point, despite the media circus. It birthed two civil wars, which have caused total societal collapse, reducing Libya to a failed state where violence and displacement are now the norm. This was done in order to open up Libyan oil for exploitation at pennies on the dollar, which likewise also allowed the trickle of immigrants to Europe to turn into a river. The short-term pursuit of profits mobilized European governments to commit unspeakable violence without any democratic mandate from the people of Europe to do so, in order to suit the profits of a handful of fossil fuel company shareholders. You can find a deeper dive into the history of modern Libya here. Replicate this across practically every former European colony. Engineered instability, imperialized markets, economic dependence, and consistent political and military meddling all creates the perfect storm of easily exploitable nations, and a steady stream of people fleeing chaos caused by those same former colonial powers. Europe isn't experiencing some kind of crisis involving migrants. That's hyperbole that serves ruling class propaganda. It's a reckoning. Refugees aren't fleeing so-called failed states, they're fleeing states Europe intentionally engineered failure in. Syria is the perfect example. Its civil war traces back to French colonial policies that weaponized sectarian divisions, turbocharged by decades of Western intervention and resource-driven coups. In East Africa, Britain's arbitrary colonial borders ignited ethnic tensions and resource wars, displacing millions of Somalis and creating perpetual instability in the region. All of this was by design, to keep these nations easily divided, their labor cheap, and their resources easy to exploit long after empire couldn't be defended. By force of arms, of course. It wasn't a slogan that brought down the French or Portuguese empires, it was guns and determined national liberation organizations. Yet some in Europe frame this mass migration we're seeing as an invasion. While words still mean things, let's remember that an invasion is when armed forces cross borders to conquer, not when families cross them to survive. Especially when the crises these families are fleeing were engineered by the countries they're fleeing to. Neither are economic migrants an invasion. Please learn what the word invasion means. The use of invasion is a racist accusation as a confession. No Tunisian occupied France, dominated economically, and made the French second-class citizens. My sincere apologies to the European right, but white genocide isn't real, no matter how powerful your cuckolding fantasies are. While the US is still the all-time champion of hypocrisy, Europe is a very close second. When 15,000 Hungarians fled in 1956, Britain rolled out red carpets, public sympathy, and job offers, framing them as heroes escaping from the Iron Curtain. And yet, these racialized migrants making their way through Libya or Syria or any other undesirable country face walls topped with barbed wire, poorly regulated detention camps, and policies like the UK's hostile environment, designed to deny healthcare, housing, and dignity to people seeking safety. This is, of course, again, by design. The system isn't broken, it's working just fine, as far as the ruling class is concerned. What Europe suffers from is colonial amnesia. Refusing to acknowledge its wealth is built on the exploitation and enslavement of the global south, which entirely subsidizes Europe's current living standards to this day. For any Europeans who hear this isn't to make you feel bad. It's only to give an explanation for why your countries are the way they are, and what's behind the politics that are driving current strange decisions, like French military bases in West Africa, or British planes bombing Libya. Even displacement due to climate change is colonial. Droughts ravaging Africa are worsened by Europe's disproportionate environmental footprint, responsible for 22% of historical CO2 emissions, despite housing just 10% of the global population. The numbers do not lie. Global refugee numbers quadrupled from 3 million to 12 million between 1970 and today, with most fleeing regions Europe once plundered. Migration isn't chaos, it's cause and effect, from colonial theft to modern displacement. Europe's so-called migration crisis isn't an accident and isn't an oversight. It's the inevitable result of a system built to cannibalize its lifelines. The same colonial logic that carved continents into their own little extractive zones has sent its chickens to roost, to quote Malcolm X. Society must go on, though, and the logic of capital dictates capital and labor must flow no matter what. The result? A broken immigration system, social unrest, and an ever-increasing dependence on an economically necessary yet politically unpopular solution, that being migration. Well, unpopular till grandma needs that surgery, or the roof needs to get fixed, or elderly home nurses, or grocery store clerks, or any manufacturing in Europe. There's many wars here. Immigrants are a scapegoat. Your enemies are the owners and movers of capital that pit you against other workers just like you who just so happen to have a different skin tone. Class is the fundamental analysis and where you should start your investigation, not something as nebulous and ridiculous as racial classification. If you still don't like immigrants, remember that it wasn't the choice of these immigrants to come to your country. The nations they hail from were destabilized and destroyed by, most likely, meddling, political and military from your country and your government. And it was those same owners of capital and government officials that allowed these immigrants in or created frameworks for them to enter into your country in the first place. Meaning, even the most staunch anti-immigrant person would be misguided if they're trying to attack immigrants for their presence in their country. If you're truly against immigration of whatever form and for whatever reason, then you would nip the problem in the bud, which is European economic exploitation of the global south and European military intervention in countries where it's never welcome. Check out my related videos on race here, my video on European exceptionalism here, and exploitation of the global south here, for a deeper dive. A better world is possible. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too.